you likely would have to be living under the proverbial rock to have not caught wind of what's going on in the United States right now, especially if you live in the United States. But even outside of the United States, what's happening now is, I'd argue, unprecedented, at least in the previous few decades. And at the outset, I feel I have to say a few things. I haven't lived in the United States for a very long time, and I have been observing it from afar. And with each passing year, it resembles less and less something that I find recognizable. Part of that is a normal process, obviously, because things change and countries change. But the direction things have been going in, say, over the past decade, has been anything but good. And I'm not one who's inclined to say X is the culmination of Y or whatever, but this is sort of a culmination of things that have been going on for quite some time. I'm not even really sure where to begin with my commentary. Needless to say, what I have to say about a political event, if you want to call this a political event, will not please some people. Some people will appreciate what I have to say. The usual. It is what it is. So, as many of you probably know, a man by the name of George Floyd was mistreated by an officer who put his knee on his neck for an excessive period of time, and this apparently led to his death. Now, the initial claim was that he died of asphyxiation, but I looked at the autopsy report, and it's not clear that he did. He apparently had some previous coronary issue, but it's very, very likely that the way the police officer was treating him led to his death, if only because of the stress being put on his body. I'm simply stating that it's not clear that it was caused by asphyxiation. Now, was this a case of police misconduct? Absolutely. There's no reason to treat anyone like that. And my initial response when I first saw this, before the rioting, looting, violence, pillaging, and arson began, was one of extreme sympathy, and I have to say I was shocked and horrified at what the police officer had done, as well as the complete indifference of the surrounding police officers. They were all engaging in what I think is a clear case of misconduct. If it was not outright murder, it certainly was a sort of indirect execution. And they should have been fired, and I think charges should have been pressed against them. That's obvious. I think relatively obvious. But that's essentially where my sympathy ends. Because one of the hallmarks of civilization is that there's a system of law and order that is maintained by people, perhaps unwittingly. We're born into this social contract, to borrow a phrase of Rousseau, this social contract of interacting with a greater society, a greater civilization. And part of that interaction demands of us that we conform to certain things we don't like. Some of the most basic of these things involve not engaging in what is deemed under the law to be criminal behavior. So, for example, robbery, looting, arson, unprovoked violence, this sort of thing. This is something that everyone who exists within a civilized society necessarily subjects himself to, because we're all part of this for better or worse. And what I find somewhat shocking, but also not somewhat shocking, is that there's not been a single condemnation of the activities that have taken place since the death of George Floyd. The term, for example, protesters, well, some of them are protesters, but most of them, by the lights of the images I've seen and the videos I've seen, are not protesting. They're criminals. They're engaging in violent behavior. They're destroying their own neighborhoods. They're destroying other people's homes. I saw several people in the city of Minneapolis who've now lost access to their apartments, which they could barely afford in the first place. What good does this do? So criminal destructive behavior, looting, robbery, arson, destruction of property, and violence to boot in some cases, none of this should be deemed an appropriate reaction to what's happened. And so I think what we're seeing here is self-serving behavior. To claim that robbery and arson is the appropriate response to somebody who is murdered or executed is simply laughable, especially when you're doing it in a city that is leagues away, thousands of miles away. For what? This has nothing to do, in this case, with justice for Floyd. This has only to do with your own instincts and your own inability to control your impulses at this stage. And that no politician can come out and just say, look, we're sympathetic to what happened. It clearly was criminal. This was a clearly criminal case of police misconduct, but is not to en masse riot and destroy everything in your path. Well, nobody seems to have the gumption or the balls to say this. The mayor of Minneapolis himself has completely cucked. He either subscribes to the current year's narrative or he's paying lip service to it. But I think he should resign because he clearly was not in a position to protect the property owners and the people who had done nothing and had nothing to do with George Floyd. And I think he's failed the citizens of his city. But more broadly, no one is willing to say something like this. A very uncontroversial statement that arson, looting, pillaging, and robbery are criminal activities, and people who engage in them should be arrested and punished. In fact, many news outlets have gone so far as to attempt to justify these actions. This is the reaction of people who feel emotional injury. Now, it is true that when people investigate murders, for example, detectives, police officers will look for a motive. They're trying to understand the reason why a potential alleged murderer has done something. Sure, you want to understand motive. What was the motivation behind it? Why did this person do this? But you don't excuse the murder itself, do you? And so we can spend time to try to understand why apparently thousands and thousands of Americans think it's appropriate to engage in violent activity against other people, destroy their property, become looters, pillagers, and arsonists, without accepting that behavior as appropriate or even tolerable. And no politician and no network can find it in themselves to condemn this, to say that two wrongs don't make a right, that these days hackneyed, old-fashioned phrase. But yes, it's true here. The fact that police officers were engaged in misconduct that led to the death of this unfortunate man has nothing to do with the reactions that we're witnessing right now. Cities aflame, cars on fire, people defecating on public property. Because whether you like it or not, when you live in a quote-unquote society, and I hate this word because it's so tainted, but there we have it, you agree to not engage in criminal activity. And if you do engage in criminal activity, then you go to jail. All the damage and destruction they're causing doesn't help one iota, doesn't help anything. It certainly doesn't help the quote-unquote black community. And who's going to pay for this? Well, taxpayers will pay for this. And nobody can come out and just say that what they're doing is wrong. Are all of them doing? Of course not. There are quote-unquote peaceful protests. But there's not the seeming majority of what I've seen so far. And it's difficult to get an accurate picture of what's going on. So that old tried and true phrase that nobody wants to hear, that two wrongs don't make a right, is fully applicable here. Yes, what the police officers did was completely wrong. And yes, what thousands of people are doing, looting, pillaging, burning things, committing violent crimes, yeah, that's wrong too. And these people need to be stopped. Now, here's a hot take a lot of people don't want to hear, and I'm pretty sure I will be condemned for this. But the reality is, on the ground, that there is a lot of police misconduct, and this misconduct is not exclusive to black people. Bad things, untimely deaths, mistakes, and yes, even malicious executions occur with people outside of the black community all the time. And if you want to just go by a numbers basis, it happens to white men more frequently than it does to black men. Now, independent of this issue, imagine if every time there were a case of police misconduct, for every ethnic or racial group, every time there were one, there were riots of this sort. There wouldn't be much left of the United States, now would there? This simply can't be tolerated if we want to have a civilized society. And here's the problem. We've come to the point now where condemning criminal activity is not possible because, let's be honest, if somebody said en masse that these activities are not to be tolerated, they would be condemned as racist. The criminality of the activities themselves, looting, arson, destruction of property, and general violence, are terms that we understand, generally speaking, under law as criminal. It has nothing to do with race, but people can't come out and say this. Most recently, from what I've seen, they've marched onto Washington, onto Capitol Hill. They burned a church down What does the church have to do with anything? And they're heading towards the White House. Now, I'm recording this on the 1st of June. By the time this is released, almost a day will have gone by. So maybe things will have changed. But nonetheless, the single most important factor here is that this behavior needs to be condemned and needs to be punished. Again, imagine if every case of police misconduct which led to the death of an individual, independent of whether he's black, white, whatever, led to this sort of thing. Well, thank the gods it doesn't, but if it did, there wouldn't be much left of the United States. There wouldn't be enough buildings around. Are there problems with the police? Absolutely. But this behavior is contemptible, and it needs to be offered contempt, because if this goes on long enough, it will set a precedent. This is a classic case, in the case of these rioters, of give them an inch, they'll take a mile. You don't want to take action against them, and they will keep on going until the cows come home. The politicians seem impotent. The populace at large seems impotent. And I don't recognize the country anymore. And I haven't in a long time, but I'd say this is pretty much the apogee of it all so far. Of course, things can get worse. So that's my take. I think it's a very, very unfortunate thing what happened to Mr. Floyd. The police were not acting appropriately. He was probably murdered. But none of the reactions that occurred afterwards that involved criminal activity, looting, robbery, arson, destruction of property, and yes, some violence I've seen as well, are appropriate or should be countenanced. Anyway, I hope not to comment too much more on this affair. It's tragic on a number of fronts. It's unfortunate. And I'm very, very disappointed by the state of affairs and the fact that no one can condemn the quote-unquote reaction to this as inappropriate, to say the least, if not outright criminal. And hey, it might be at this stage GG USA. Maybe it was GG a long time ago. I have no idea. You take care. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. And may the gods watch over you. Because if you're in the US, you really need them to watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.